welcome fellow subscribers and other racing fans. Today another setup 101, and what do? We take the Cadillac GT3 out for a drive at Nürburgring Nordschleife. Let's not waste time and start directly with the initial thoughts. The Cadillac has much power, well, not as much as other cars, however. Having a turbo engine, it has more power than many of the natural aspirated cars at Nordschleife, because we are speaking of altitudes of about 500 to 700 meters here. I already drove a lap with the cars before starting to tune it, so what can I already tell you? The rear is quite unstable. It seems stable at first, but you need to be very careful with it, else, well, the rear will just go away and you spin. Yeah. Basically, we want to try to give it more wing here, as I think most of the instability comes from the fast-paced corners. So, fast speed, instability on the rear means more wing on the rear. Also, I think the initial tire pressures are quite high for the car, so let's decrease them by 0.2 or 0.3. Also, we will reduce the cambers a little bit, as experience proved that you gain more by lowering the cambers to get better traction and better braking power, instead of having the stability through the corners, because at corners we do not get much faster with higher camber. Also, for better traction, we will reduce the acceleration diff and increase the deceleration diff, well, while decreasing the acceleration diff seems to be very logical to you, because the rear will not step out as much. If you're on the throttle, you might ask, why do we increase the deceleration diff? Tony didn't do this before. Well, last week's made it more clear to me that in some cars, for example the Aston, the rear comes around too much in off-throttle situations and destabilizes the whole car, making you slower overall. Although with a lower deceleration diff you get around the corners better, but in my opinion this is nullified by the instability you get from that, and therefore you lose more time. And after all, we want to gain time, don't we? So we increase the deceleration lock. Last but not least, in this iteration, we increase the caster angle. Not sure yet if this is a good change. We need to test it, but therefore I'm making this video. However, in the Aston, from experience, that's better, just because it gave the car more stability in most situations actually, and well, if you're driving smoothly, that makes you faster. Okay, let's go out on track again. Okay, here we go again. After an hour of testing, I made several changes to the car. Well, first I started with the brakes. The brake ducts a little bit too wide open for Nordschleife. Also, I reduced the brake pressures a little bit. Reason for that is that I had the feeling the brakes were locking up a little bit, although having ABS enabled, but over the bumps sometimes brakes got too wheels got too slow too quickly, in my opinion, and therefore making the car more unstable than it needed to be. So that goes hand in hand with the brake balance being more to the rear now. I could not have done that without reducing the pressures and the brake ducts, and more rear bias helps to reduce understeering under braking. Next thing to change was the radiator. I'm sure it can be more aggressive even. I just reduced it slightly. Cars don't tend to overheat very quickly on Nordschleife anyway. Also, I've been testing under quite warm conditions, so I'm sure you can reduce it to 30 or 20 if you want to. Now let's come to the springs and sway bars. I did something strange here maybe, but let me explain. Well, first of all, I reduced the sway bars by a huge amount. This is important because all the bumps on this track and not so many fast-paced corners where you need the cornering speed through the stability of the car. So it's much better to have lower sway bars. Of course, that's completely different on other tracks. However, here reduced to 50 and 5. Maybe the rear can be reduced even more. I would also go down to 1 if necessary. However, the springs, I made them 1 click stiffer. So why is that? You might think, okay, Nordschleife, very bumpy track, you need softer springs. And yes, in general, yes, to increase the mechanical grip, you need to soften the springs. However, the problem is the car is buttoning out. It's buttoning out quite much, and this causes the car to get unstable. And we don't want the car unstable, because that means it's hard to drive and it tends to oversteer quite often. So this is something I learned from the RSR Hockenheim classic race with the old Lotus Formula car. If your car tends to bottom out quite often, it helps greatly to stiffen the springs. It won't bottom out as much after that anymore. And in combination with the softer sway bars, you gain a little bit of mechanical grip again. So this goes hand in hand and helps overall to make the car more stable. After all, we are making a race setup here and not a hot lap setup. If you want hot lap, make the springs stiffer, that would be better. Okay, another setting very important for the whole buttoning out topic is a bump stop and also ride height. So the bump stops needed to be increased a little bit. That helps with the many bumps on the road. Of course, it makes the car a little bit stiffer because you have less travel in the suspension. However, I think it's necessary, and testing a 30 in comparison to 25 helped a little bit, definitely. However, that's also only possible if you increase the ride height a little bit, and I'd recommend that every time. And Nordschleife, you know, with lower ride height you get faster cornering speeds in general, and the car is behaving better under brakes and throttle as it's not rolling as much. But here again, the whole buttoning out issue, with higher ride height you get a more safe car. It's behaving better in the corners over the bumps, on the cost of maybe straight line speed on Göttingen Höhe straight, and a little bit of a wobbly feeling, you know. It's not as precise anymore. It's kind of hovering over the bottom a little bit, at least it feels like it. Strange to describe. Not as racy anymore, but for a longer race I would always recommend it. But also keep in mind, I'm always doing those setup 101s with half a fuel tank. So if you are only doing short races or hot lapping, this is kind of another topic, as the car is lighter then, so the ride height increases anyway, and you might want to go down again with the ride height with low fuel, as I said. However, full fuel tank, if you're doing full fuel stints, you always want to increase the ride height a little bit. So far so good. Still I need to test if the gearing is okay. For now I think there are reserves on the Döttinger Höhe straight that are unused, so maybe we can lower the gear ratios a little bit, but we'll see about that. Also I will test UC's damper settings. If you have not seen them, they're on projectcarsetups.eu. I will test them and report back after another testing session. Okay, back with the latest results. I applied UC damper settings and I'm quite happy with them. Although they induce a little bit of understeering for the car, which is not the worst thing. Because I also decided to decrease the rear sway bar a little bit further. We are now down to 2. Also, for the sake of tire temperatures, I adjusted the tire pressures a little bit. Front tires got a little bit too cold or not hot enough in comparison to the rear tires. Although the car is quite understeery now, which I like. I am always a fan of understeering if it gets to the decision to under or oversteer. Obviously you want to have a very balanced car, but if I have to choose any of the two, I want to have understeering. Well, however, front's a little bit too cold in comparison to the rears. I increased the rear pressures by 0.05 and reduced them in the front by the same amount, so we are at both axles at 180 now. I decided against shorter gears. Reason for that, I did observe the torque and power on the longer straights of the circuit, and we get maximum power with the current gearing, but still have reserves for slipstream driving and or low tank driving, which will also give us some kilometers per hour extra, which we need to take into account with our gearing. So we leave it at default. It also makes me think that for most other tracks you probably need to reduce the final gear in the Cadillac. So those are the 3 last changes I want to do for the car. Now let's get back and talk about all the changes and why I did change them and what they are changing in the car's behavior in general. Okay, here we are. Setup screen opening. First of all, tire pressures. I explained that last, so you probably have it in mind still. We reduced the tire pressures by a rather big amount, because if you see here, we tested with a 35 degrees Celsius track temperature, which is rather high, especially for Nürburgring Nordschleife, you can believe me. Okay. Still, tires were not overheating too much. On faster laps, I noticed temperatures up to 108 degrees Celsius. Overheating, I would say, starting at this temperature. However, if it's only for some corners, it's still okay. So yeah, we also reduced the front pressures more in comparison to the rear pressures. Reason for that was the balance of the car and the balance of the temperatures of the car, which were not that much hotter on the front, or I think it's the other way around, if anything. Okay. We reduced the brake pressure a little bit. Reason for that was over the bumps, wheels kind of not locking up, as ABS prevents that. However, probably getting too slow too quickly, and it's one step before locking up, and it also makes the car unstable if the tire, for example, is in the air and gets slowed down quite an amount, then it gets back on track and you have the same feeling as locking up, although it's not locking up. But to prevent that, brake pressure is reduced a little bit. Brake balance, 2 clicks to the rear. Well, that's personal opinion, of course. I like them to be more to the rear if possible, because if they are 60% at the front, for example, like it was on default here, you get a little bit understeering on the brakes, which I don't really like. Brake ducts, not tested in the long run, should be okay with 50%. Default was 75. Maybe it's okay, maybe you need to adjust it depending on the race you are driving in. Traction control slip, I left it at default. I think 9% is quite a nice setting. If you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, you can reduce the slip amount. If you're feeling totally comfortable, you can also deactivate the traction control completely or increase it however you like it. Okay, let's get back. Next setting, well, fuel load, of course you need it like you need to set it like you need it. My fuel consumption over lap was 11.5 liters. So yeah, that's approximately what you need. Don't count too much on the laps it shows in the menu. They are very conservative. Wastegate pressure, of course, we leave it at default, which is the maximum. We want maximum power. Brake mapping, I increased it. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. I increased it by 1 click as my last setting, just to help with oversteering and off-throttle situation. You know, the same reason we increased the acceleration lock. Yeah, basically that's it here. Final drive, we left it at default. I think gearing works pretty good for Nordschleife. Now here, that's interesting, acceleration lock down to 10% and the acceleration lock up to 100% makes the car more stable under braking and also more stable under acceleration. Radiator 40%, default was 50. You can probably decrease it a little bit further, but it doesn't bring you too much on the straights, so it's not always worth it. We increased the bump stops to go with the bumps on the tracks, and there is the previously not described damper settings from UC. I trust the settings as I also always set them quite soft. It helps on most tracks to make the car more stable. So they are reduced and the fast rebounds are also quite reduced. I didn't touch the slow dampers as I think the car is quite okay under the slow rolling movements, which is corner rolls and acceleration and braking rules. Increased ride height, what was default? I think 6, 7, something like that, clicks higher. You can go higher even, however I wouldn't always recommend it because the car really starts to feel quite wobbly if you go higher. But also you need to go higher because else the car is just butting out too brutal and you lose the car over those bumps. Also the reason I increased the spring rates by 1 click. make the car more stable over bumps. Well, not over bumps per se, but over the brutal bumps where you're bottoming out. Then we reduce the sway bars quite harshly in the front and in the rear, and last I also reduced the rear even more. Keep in mind that it uses some understeer in low speed corners. However, I take that rather than have the rear step out at a point where I really don't like it. So this is more a safety measure. Then we increased the caster angle. I also made the experience with the Aston that higher caster angles, they make the cars more stable, and you don't really have a disadvantage with that. Maybe you get some understeering in certain situations, but overall I would always choose the higher angle. We reduced the cambers very much. As I explained, you get better braking and acceleration with the lower camber settings, and I prefer that. If you prefer more stable car through the corners, you might want to increase them, but yeah, that's up to you. We didn't touch the toe-in. More toe-in in the rear makes the car more stable. So yeah, it's quite much already, I think. So I didn't touch it. More negative toe-in in the front makes the car more responsive on turn-in. We don't really need it with that car because it's quite responsive already. Now the rear downforce, we increased it. We kept the front 1 and increased the rear from 7 to 10 to make the car more stable in the faster corners. I really like that setting. If you want to go low downforce, you probably want to use 0 and 5 then to keep the balance. It's probably possible, and for Nürburgring Nordschleife maybe better. However, I don't really trust myself there. I need the additional grip of the higher downforce at this point. Well, I still drive 640, 645 with half a fuel tank, and I think that's okay for 110. You can go faster on Nordschleife with 0.5 for sure, so for hot lapping reduce it, but yeah, I think the risk is not worth it in a race, and actually we are doing a race setup here. Okay, so we are through with all the car settings. Now I can also show you my force feedback settings, as people are always wanting to know them. But yeah, I'm always using kind of the same settings, which is reduced master scale, but of course this goes hand in hand of the force feedback you set in the menu. I also reduced it there. However, I kind of like to reduce them in the GT3 cars as well. Yeah, then I increased FX. This makes it, or this increases the feel of the longitudinal lateral and vertical forces, which are those three, and Fx is the force of the car stepping out, for example. You feel it better. Everything else I reduced to reduce clipping. Okay, now here you have the summary screen, maybe better for taking the settings from the video. However, I will also upload them to projectcarsetups.eu. Okay, so there you go. This is the setup 101 for a Cadillac GT3 for the new US Car Pack GT3 car at Nürburgring Nordschleife. Never did one for Nürburgring Nordschleife, however, doing an AOR race here, so I needed to do a setup anyway, so why not do a setup 101 as well. Hope you enjoyed and see you next time. Bye bye.